Sing number 75 in this supplemental hymnal. This is an Epiphany hymn, and Epiphany, of course, is coming up. Tomorrow is the 12th day of Christmas, so tomorrow night is 12th night, and then we'll have Epiphany on Thursday. So we may as well sing an Epiphany hymn, Saw You Never in the Twilight. Be led in prayer by Pastor Mark Balthrop of the Redeemer Reformed Church of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma.
Let's pray. Oh, Father, you are great and greatly to be praised. Praised in your church that spreads through the world, blessing the nations. We give you thanks for this time together, for Steve Wilkins and the session here at this church and the many years and sacrifice and work that they have put on for this conference, which has truly changed the world in our time. I pray that you will give us boldness to speak, as Dr. Lightheart mentioned this morning, that we will not hold back or shilly-shally or even be so interested in cultural engagement that we say anything less than the truth. I pray for Aaron Renn now, that he will speak to us in a way that we will know that we have heard from you, that your word has been opened to us. We ask these things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, who dwells with you in the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever. Amen.
Just a quick reminder of some of the announcements. Remember the book table. All the Athanasius books are on sale. If you don't have them, this is a great time to pick them up and use them. The commentaries especially are so helpful, so I encourage you to do that. Remember our question and answer session. We had great questions today, so we have one more tomorrow. So write down those questions and put them in the basket up here. And again, we'll have Matins service in the morning at 8:30. If you can make it then, we'll have a break after that and begin again at 9:15 in the morning. Okay, very good. Now we welcome Aaron Renn for his second talk. Aaron, please welcome him.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out. So last night, I noted how religious observance in America, church attendance, peaked in the 1950s when about half of all the adults in the country attended church every week. And then how the church attendance and status of Christianity in society had steadily eroded over the course of the decades since. And that period of erosion could be divided into three distinct phases or worlds that I labeled the positive, the neutral, and the negative world. And these words refer to the way that society views Christianity, starting out viewing it still positively, then going into a neither positive nor negative phase, and then since about 2014, moving into a truly unprecedented era in America, where for the first time in the 400-year history of this country, society at large now basically views Christianity negatively. Being known as a Christian can actually hurt you in secular elite society. And then I talked a little bit about the different strategies of engagement or ministry strategies that evangelicals developed over the course of the positive and the neutral world. And in the positive world, there were a couple. There was the religious right or culture war strategy, and then there was the seeker sensitivity strategy. And then in the neutral world, there was, the cultural engagement strategy. And what I observed is that from an evangelical church perspective, there essentially was not any strategy that has evolved for how to really live in the negative world. And so I said it will probably not just be one or two strategies, it will probably be a diversity of strategies to deal with the diverse situations in which people find themselves. It may require a lot of trial and error and new generations of leaders. Well, today I want to talk about a strategy for the negative world that I think may be applicable in certain locations. Monroe might actually be one of them, that I call owned space. Now, I started off writing about men's issues several years ago because I noticed that hordes of young men were tuning into people like Jordan Peterson, or they were turning into this collection of websites called the Manosphere that had everything from pickup artists to men's rights activists to people arguing that you should avoid marriage and all kinds of stuff, and as well as all these sort of fringe political figures that you find on the internet. So I was kind of familiar with these different groups because I saw young men were going there instead of the church, and I'm like, I want young men to be in the church instead. But a few years ago, some people started telling me that I needed to read a book called Bronze Age Mindset by one of these internet figures who called himself the Bronze Age Pervert, or BAP. And I said, that's ridiculous. There's no way I'm reading that book. I'm not afraid to read these kind of online dissident thinkers, but this is too ridiculous to take seriously. But then I saw a review of the book by Michael Anton in the Claremont Review of Books, and I saw some other more serious people talking about it, so I gave it a read, and all I can say is I do not recommend that you read it. It is deliberately designed to be as offensive as possible to normal people. But apparently the guy who wrote it, this BAP character, is actually a PhD from Yale, and he had a few interesting concepts in there, one of which was something that he called owned space. And I just want to read a brief excerpt from his book, which is written in a very bizarre style, but bear with me. He says, struggle for space. A healthy animal, not under distress, not maimed, not trapped by man, seeks first when young, space. Animals seek space in physical sense, territory, but this meaning isn't crudely physical. I give this as vivid image, which is true for many animals that seek ownership of concrete territory. But more generally, you must take it to mean something else, space to develop inborn powers. Then he writes a little bit and continues and gets to say, you must learn to see the secret language of nature and what it drives at. Life, at its most basic, is a struggle for ownership of space. Now, leave aside his particular conception of owned space And I think this idea of space, of territory, and who owns it is very important. And we can think about owned space in a variety of contexts, a broad context. Yes, it could refer to who owns physical real estate and buildings, but it can also refer to economic ownership. It can refer to social ownership. It can refer to cultural ownership. And if you do not have owned space, then you are going to find yourself at a profound disadvantage in what you're doing. For example, a lot of people have managed to earn a pretty good living as influencers on YouTube or Instagram. But because they are using a platform that they don't own, that's owned by somebody else, their livelihood, and in fact, their entire digital presence can be deleted with a few keystrokes by some low-level drone in one of these companies. And that, in fact, has happened to a lot of people. You know, their source of income completely dried up because they got kicked off Twitter or whatever. This actually happened to entire companies. I don't know how many of you remember, probably over a decade ago now, if you were on Facebook, Farmville, that Farmville app everybody was playing from a company called Zynga, I think it was. Well, Facebook, let them on there, and then Facebook kicked them off. And financial analyst Bern Hobart has noted that if you build a business on someone else's platform, in the end, you're either doing R&D for features that they will add later, or you're setting yourself up to cede them your margins. That is to say, to give them all the money. So people are usually happy to have you build on their space, at least at first, because when you build on somebody else's space, you're making that more valuable for them. But at some point, once you've used up your usefulness to them, they're either going to kick you off or they're going to rewrite the deal to take all the money for themselves. And when I started my Christian men's newsletter, The Masculinist, I deliberately started it as an email list for a number of reasons, but one of them is, with an email list, I own it. For my podcast or my YouTube channel, I don't actually know who's even listening or watching. They don't tell me that. YouTube, Google, Apple, they know, but I don't even know. But with a mailing list, it belongs to me. I know who subscribes to my list. And so if my email provider, I'm on Substack now, aaronrenn.substack.com, if they decide tomorrow to kick me off, too bad. That's okay. But I have a copy of my mailing list and I can go send it somewhere else. And yes, all these companies can gang up on you and collectively kind of kick you off the internet. That sort of happened to Donald Trump, but that's pretty rare, and you really kind of have to fall afoul of things in a very serious way to get yourself in trouble. And one of the biggest problems faced by conservatives in America, and by the way, I want to qualify this term conservative. The term conservative can mean a lot of things. It can mean a Christian conservative, it can mean a political conservative, it can mean a cultural conservative. And I'm just going to use the word conservative because although these are not exactly completely overlapping circles, I think there are a lot of common dispositions, attitudes, and situations in which all of these different groups find themselves. So even if you might only put yourself in one of those categories, I'm still talking to you. But one of the problems that is faced by conservatives in America is that they exist and operate almost entirely inside space owned by other people. Legally owned in many cases, yes, but also more importantly, culturally, economically, and socially owned by other people. So I used to live in New York City. And so I think a lot about the Christians in New York City, of which there are quite a few evangelicals in Manhattan now. But if you look at all the evangelical churches in Manhattan below 96th Street, which is usually what people think of, that's south of Harlem, that's the core of kind of upscale Manhattan, it's a very large area, I can only identify 5 of those churches that actually own their own building. That's actually pretty good, but only 5. So most of those churches don't even own the building that they meet in. Now, I'm actually of two minds about owning expensive real estate in the negative world. Real estate is great, but also kind of makes you vulnerable if your tax exemption gets revoked, etc. But nevertheless, I think it's interesting. These people don't even own the buildings they meet in. So they have to keep their landlords happy. And more importantly, they don't really have any cultural space. most of the Christians who've moved to New York City have moved to the city because they want to live in the city. They share the values of the city. They aspire to belong in the city. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it also means that they're under a lot of pressure to culturally conform in the city. They're sort of under the thumbs of their cultural landlords, if you will. And so when the culture shifts, they're under a lot of pressure to conform to that. A lot of them also, again, work in high-level positions in business or other organizations from which you can't be too far out of line from the party line, or you'll find yourself out of a job. And so these are Christians that in a lot of ways are like people trying to build a business on YouTube. And in the case of New York City, that's okay, because it's very hard to acquire own space in New York, probably impossible. I mean, you could buy a few buildings here and there, but even just buying one building, enormously expensive. New York is the cultural and financial capital of America. We need to have Christians there that believe in the Bible, but it's just not fertile territory for acquiring own space. And so what would it look like tangibly for a Christian community to acquire and have owned space in a particular place? And I want to talk about that using the example of the Christ Church community in Moscow, Idaho. And I just really think it's a great case study there. And I'm going to kind of give this a little bit as if it's like a Harvard Business School case study. It's not going to be a lot of theology per se, but it's going to be more about how they've structured what they do, which could be applicable to other people who kind of share their theology, or maybe to others as well. And this model of owned space, by the way, I actually came up with it from studying Christ Church. The whole thing with BAP, I took the name owned space from him, but I really didn't take anything else from him. But I just think owned space is a great way to think about it. I actually think it's a better name than Benedict option when it comes to thinking about what they've accomplished. I first came across Doug Wilson probably a decade ago, and I was reading, he was still on Blogspot at the time. He had this like Blog and Mablog or whatever it was. And people send me links, and I'm reading it, and I saw that he was in Idaho. And I immediately just applied a huge discount. I said, this guy's probably holed up in some sovereign citizen compound out there. Most of us, we live in the real world, And so whatever this guy wants to say out in Idaho, he can kind of pontificate out there, but it's not really relevant to most of society. And, so I really didn't pay that much attention to him. And then a few years ago, he actually invited me, unsolicited, to come be part of an Amazon Prime talk show that they were producing called Man Rampant. And so I went out there and I filmed a couple episodes of the show. It's actually, I think it's episode 3 and episode 5. It's in the first season of Man Rampant. You can find it on Amazon Prime. It really turned out great. I was very pleased with how it turned out, so I would recommend and encourage you to check it out. But when I went out there, I discovered that the reality of Doug Wilson in Moscow, Idaho, was very different from what I'd had in mind when I just heard Idaho. And in fact, I think that's a very common reaction, and I think that's one reason they like to get people to come out there, because it really lets them show off who they are and let people see them for what they are. For one thing, they're not living in a sovereign citizen compound or some kind of bunker. Moscow, Idaho is actually the state university town of Idaho. It's the proverbial blue dot in the red state, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And the ministry out there in Moscow actually did not start with Doug. It started with his father, Jim. His father, Jim, I think is still alive. In fact, he was alive when I was out there a few years ago, and just a delightful man. And I think it's interesting that Jim Wilson did not go to Moscow, Idaho, in order to run away from something else. Instead, he picked Moscow sight unseen by studying it on a map because he thought it was a target market that he could win for Christ. And what he did is he applied a doctrine he had learned in the military called the strategic point. And the strategic point is a place that is two things. It's both important and it's feasible. So again, New York City, our example. New York City is extremely important, maybe the most important city in America, but it was certainly not feasible for a guy like Jim Wilson to go think, well, I'm just going to go take over New York City for Christ. Too audacious. So he said, what are some communities that actually are both important and feasible? And he alighted on college towns. They're important because they're training the next generation of leaders in their cultural production centers. They're feasible because they're small. And so he sort of did a market scan, and he picked the Moscow area, and he picked it because it was sort of a 2-for-1 special. So Moscow is home to the University of Idaho, which is the flagship university of the state of Idaho. 8 miles away, just across the state line, is Pullman, Washington. And Pullman, Washington is home to Washington State University, which is the land-grant university in the state of Washington. And so I think the choice of Moscow was inspired. It was really, really an inspired choice. I'm not sure when he got to Moscow. It was probably in the 60s or 70s. But in 1980, Moscow only had 16,500 people. So this was a genuinely small town. It was not like some, say, Big Ten or SEC college towns, which are really small cities. Once you get to like a couple 100,000 people, it's not really truly a college town anymore. And the University of Idaho Idaho's not a big state, so it's smaller for a state flagship, only 10, 12,000 students. It's not very prestigious. It's not a top 100 school, doesn't have a lot of money. You can think of it as being a Division II school. Now, it may actually be Division I in football, I don't know. But the idea is this is sort of a second-tier state college. It's the flagship university of Idaho. So within the state of Idaho, it's the top school, but it's not like trying to go, again, into a Big Ten or SEC-type Power 5 conference city where you've got these much larger, much richer, much more prestigious universities. In fact, I won't swear to this, but I think he originally went to Pullman and opened a Christian bookstore in Pullman, where Washington State is. And again, that's more difficult because Washington State's in the Pac-12. They're a Power 5 school. And so, for whatever reason, how it worked out, they sort of refocused on Moscow, which turned out to be, I think, very, very smart. So it was a place that was important, but also feasible. And I just think that this was super, super important. The fact that Jim Wilson selected Moscow, right, as an expansionary, missionary place to go, using a strategy modeled after a military attack strategy, set a very, very different tone in Moscow than in virtually every other Christian enterprise. The initial frame in which you start anything has a essentially permanent stamp on it. It could be a relationship, it could be a business, it could be a ministry. How you start something really seems to indelibly stamp it. In fact, in geography, they've got something they call the rule of first effective settlement, which basically says that the first people who permanently settle a place essentially permanently set the culture of that place. There's a great book about this called Albion's Seed by David Hackett Fisher. It's a pretty thick book, but it's awesome. He talks about 4 regional American cultures and how they originated in 4 different founding populations that came from different part of the British Islands. Albion is just another name for Great Britain. And so I think Jim Wilson's vision of capturing a strategic town for Christ set essentially a tone that has characterized the Moscow enterprise ever since. And this is very important because I think almost all conservatives are people who are in a kind of a retreat mode. So we see that, California is going down the tubes. Let's move to Texas. Let's move to Texas. The city got voted Democrat. Let's move to the suburbs. My church is going woke, so let's leave and go to the church plant down the street. Public school's getting crazy. Let's go over here. And not to say that these are all bad, but it's a mentality of essentially running away from something, trying to get away from essentially the onslaught of the left. And what we see in Moscow is the exact opposite. They're like, we're not running away. We're on the attack. We're on the advance, not on the retreat. And it gives them tremendous cultural confidence to be distinct and to really have a certain swagger about what they're doing. Now, exactly how Christ Church itself got started, how Doug became the pastor, to be quite honest, I don't know. But they've grown to be pretty sizable. They probably, I would estimate, they have 1,000 to 1,500 attendees at the church and various affiliated congregations. So that's a pretty sizable share of the population in a town of 25,000 people. So they've built critical mass there. And one way they did that is through Doug's blogging. Now, I mentioned this sort of incentive structure of social media, and I think Doug has a pretty sophisticated understanding of marketing. And so he knows that a good marketer, at some level, wants to be a little polarizing. You want people who love you, even if it means there's some people who hate you. You don't want people who are sort of, I don't really care, kind of lukewarm about it. And so his blogging really got their name out and attracted all these like-minded people to move to Moscow and said, wow, I want to be a part of this. But maybe more importantly, his blogging also repels people who don't think the way that he does. One reason a lot of churches kind of end up drifting left or going liberal is because they're full of a lot of, you might think, squishy moderates. They're kind of people who are attracted because there's a lot of energy in the church. Maybe there's a lot of vibrant community. It's a lot more exciting than the kind of dying mainline church down the street. They're like, oh, let's come here. But there are people who are really not interested in controversy. They're not interested in, kind of being low status. And as a result, this is the natural constituency for capitulation to essentially emerging secular culture. They really don't want to have a lot of, conflict. And so with Doug Wilson being so high profile and so sort of controversial, those kinds of people don't go anywhere near Christ Church in Moscow, because these are the kinds of people who don't want to have to tell all their friends they attend Doug Wilson's church. I mean, if you think that, you go out there, you got to tell everybody you attend Doug Wilson's church, and a lot of people aren't willing to do that. And so I think in some extent it's important to repel people who are not aligned as it is to attract people who kind of are aligned. And so just to kind of recap that, first, Jim Wilson went to Moscow on sort of on the advance, not on the retreat, and they built critical mass through being able to attract the like-minded and kind of filter out people who are not aligned. And in addition to the church, they also have been incredible institution builders. Doug invented classical Christian education, basically, and they got their logo school out there. They also have a liberal arts college called New St. Andrews. They have a pastor's training program and a great media company called Canon Press. But I think a lot of Christian ministries have built sort of Christian institutions, but there are 3 additional areas of institution building and sort of enterprise development that I think truly set them apart and really get directly at this idea of owned space. They have acquired and built owned space across 3 dimensions in Moscow. They have acquired physical ownership of real estate. They have acquired economic ownership through the creation of scalable wealth-generating businesses. And they have acquired essentially social, cultural ownership by creating consumer-oriented businesses and places for their people to go. So I will talk a little bit about that. Christ Church has a building, but I think more importantly than that, kind of ministries affiliated with the church, just members of the congregation, not through any centralized strategic plan, but just kind of on their own, bought up a large amount of real estate in the central commercial core of downtown Moscow, including on Main Street. Now, Moscow is the bluest city in Idaho. I cannot name another case anywhere in America where in the state university town, a conservative group acquired a significant amount of real estate on the main commercial corridor of the city. I mean, I think it's basically unprecedented. And the ownership of the sites means they can't be evicted. And so you think about people who are very controversial, one of the things that you run into, and these churches in New York have to face this, is if you make the wrong people mad, they start a social media campaign to get you canceled. And one of the things that they've done to some people is pressured landlords to evict people or not renew their lease. And so if you're this very controversial church and you're dependent on a lease from some very progressive landlord, you're kind of in a hard spot. Well, that's not a problem for them because they own the real estate, or they certainly own a lot of real estate. You can't pressure their landlords because they are the landlords. Secondly, the church has attracted a lot of high wattage entrepreneurs who've created essentially scalable, wealth-generating businesses, or other people came in and sort of brought a high-paying job with them by working remotely. And I think the university probably has more money than the church people, but at this point, and it wasn't always this way for sure, but at this point, I actually think the people from Christ Church have the townies financially outgunned, which is one reason that they've been able to acquire all this real estate. In fact, when the townspeople kind of figured out that they were buying up properties, they started panicking. And now every time a property, somebody thinks it might sell, everybody's trying to arrange, it's like a big war to see who can get control of that. And then, of course, these businesses can employ church members. Wouldn't it be amazing, for a lot of people to be able to work for a company that's, with people that share your values? Wouldn't that be nice? And that also kind of could create the possibility of, call it cancellation insurance. Maybe I don't work for one of the church businesses, but if I lose my job, I might have a place to land, maybe even for a while. Gives you more confidence there. And of course, it's actually good for the community to have these tax-paying employers, employees locals. Now, as it turns out, the main business, this one high-tech business there in town that was run by the church people, but they didn't actually own it. It was owned by an out-of-town entity and sort of was taken over in a kind of a quasi-hostile takeover. And so it remains to see how that will be sorted out. But actually, I think it's going to work out to the benefit of the town, actually, because so many entrepreneurial people are already starting other businesses. And then lastly, a number of people from the church have started high-quality, consumer-oriented businesses. So there's a coffee shop on the main street. There's a burger, kind of beer bar. Somebody was opening a pizza place the last time I talked to them. And it's kind of interesting. When I went there the first time, there were two main coffee shops in town. There was sort of the university crowd coffee shop and the church crowd coffee shop. And a lot of them wouldn't patronize the other person's business, although I'm sure there were a lot of people in the middle there. And, there's other coffee shops that have opened now, so I think it's a little more of a diverse landscape. But this is one where, again, this gives them a sort of social cultural ownership. Isn't it nice to be able to go get a cup of coffee and not be subjected to propaganda by people who basically are opposed to a lot of your values? Wouldn't it be nice to just go in there and be able to get a cup of coffee? I always tell people, I don't want to go to a coffee shop with like crosses dangling off the ceiling and the Christian flag waving above the bar and stuff. I just want to have a cup of coffee and not have to deal with all this propaganda that you find all the time. And so that's nice. And then again, when you own these businesses, it helps because you are less subject to cancellation. It's like, oh, you mean people can't come to our coffee shop? Well, if they said that, they say, fine. We have our own coffee shop, and our coffee shop's actually better. In fact, I went to both the coffee shops, and Boosters, the one that the church people own, is actually better. And so I think in this case, they have physical ownership of the buildings. They have economic ownership of these scalable wealth generating businesses. And then they have sort of social, cultural ownership through the ownership of things like coffee shops and restaurants that are sort of for socializing, these third places as some of them. And this really lets them exert very powerful cultural presence in town. They might be a minority there. They might not, the counties might not like them, but the Christ Church people are there. They're very, very visible, and they bring a lot of attention to the town of a type that a lot of the locals probably don't want, and they're very, very, very hard to intimidate or get rid of. And so I call this the Moscow stack, the own space stack. And when you put it all together, it's pretty powerful. So one, they have a mentality of advance, not retreat. And part of that gives them, again, this kind of cultural confidence to be different, to kind of be who they are. They've built a critical mass of people relative to the population. They've developed a mechanism for building that critical mass through attracting the like-minded. How do they attract the like-minded? Through Doug's blogging, and then repelling people who are not like-minded. And then they've achieved economic ownership through the creation of these scalable wealth-generating businesses that, again, they generate wealth, they employ community members, and they contribute to the community. They hire other community members, they pay taxes, etc. They've acquired social ownership through these, again, consumer-oriented businesses like coffee shops, which, again, benefit the church, also benefit the community. It's an amenity for the community. And then they've acquired strategic commercial and residential real estate in the cultural historic town center of Moscow, which, again, I would argue investment in real estate's good. Taxes, pays taxes, makes property values go up, etc. Now, there's something missing off of this list that you might think was one of the number one things they would do. Does anybody want to take a guess what it is? I could call on somebody since there's a lot of students here and be like, boom, boom. Politics. Actually, it's only been in the last few years that anybody from the church really got involved in running for office. It's interesting when you associate kind of Christian conservatives with kind of Republican politics and political activism. They were really not that involved in politics at the local level until recently. But if you wanted to add politics to this mix, you could. And so I think this is very powerful. And I think this is a model that's potentially applicable to lots of places in the negative world, because when you have all of this owned space, it makes you more resilient, more resistant to this pressure that comes in. Now, since I used the Moscow community as an example of a negative world strategy, I do want to highlight that I actually do not classify them as a negative world community. I consider them a positive world community because I think they still very much operate in a culture war paradigm. In fact, their sort of community network or social network is actually called Fight, Laugh, Feast. So fighting with people is really a big part of their identity, and I very much think that's a culture war mentality. And candidly, I think they've sort of created some problems for themselves with that out there that they did not need to do. Nevertheless, it's a very formidable, very impressive community, and I think a lot of the aspects of this are very relevant for Christian communities in places where doing some of these things is feasible. Again, not really feasible in Manhattan, but it may be feasible in Monroe. And again, I think there are some other examples you might look at if you wanted to see people doing similar models. I haven't studied these in detail. I haven't visited them, but they might be worth looking into. There's a trad Catholic community in St. Mary's, Kansas that has about 2,600 people in that town. I think over half the town is now associated with this trad Catholic community. I think it's interesting that the St. Mary's people did not try to penetrate the actual regional center, which was Topeka, but instead they kind of took over a satellite town 30 minutes away. So they're within commuting distance of the major kind of center, but they were on a satellite. And I think Topeka's the state capital. Would not have been feasible for them to really acquire own space in Topeka, but in St. Mary's they were able to do it. There are also a lot of trad Catholics going to Coeur d'Alene, Iowa, in northern Idaho, Spokane, Washington area. You might also look at the Mormons, who sort of acquired own space over the state of Utah. If you may think about that. There are some Hasidic Jewish groups that have done things like this in towns in New Jersey and New York, outside of the New York City area. And then the Scientologists famously bought out most of downtown Clearwater, Florida. And so I think there's a lot that could be learned from a lot of these communities, even if they have some different ideas theologically. Again, look at it as a Harvard Business School case study. And the Christ Church folks have really figured out how to show off what they do well. And I think that's why they like to have people come out there, because so many people have kind of a mistaken view of them. And I think it's very easy to come away from there saying, wow, we could do this where I live. I see this town right out on the outskirts of the metro area where it would be perfect for this. And, that's sort of the first thing I thought. I said, man, Indiana, it's full of these small towns. A lot of them are kind of decaying. They need some kind of investment, TLC. They're not too far away from the big city. They build something like that. But basically, almost nobody's done it. I mean, it's amazing that I think lots of people probably had this idea, but almost no one's ever done it. And I think that's interesting. I can actually cite a few kind of urban church examples at the neighborhood level, but they don't really come close because they're similar to Manhattan. So where I live in Indianapolis, there are some kind of residential areas who've been colonized by people from churches. But again, they aspire to sort of culturally assimilate in the city, and so you kind of don't even really know they're there from a religious perspective. And the people, I think, that are really making waves in urban areas actually are the new monastics, who tend to skew to the left. And so, yes, they may vote the same as the areas where they've located, but they have a very confident cultural agenda of their own. And I think in general, people on the left are really excellent at sort of colonizing and territory and institutions to acquire new owned space. So you think about the proverbial city where the artists are looking for cheap rents for their studios, so they go into the old warehouse district. They start, opening little studios there, having events. The next thing you know, the professional managerial class comes in. They start gentrifying the place, and then all of a sudden you have Williamsburg, Brooklyn, or a place like that. And there's lots of these neighborhoods. And although the studies basically show gentrification doesn't actually displace anybody, very few people are actually displaced, the cultural ownership of the territory completely changes. So we saw this happen in Oakland, California, when kind of the new yuppies moving in started complaining to the city about gospel choirs practicing. So a lot of these black churches, their gospel choirs have been practicing for years and years and years. All of a sudden these new people move in, they're complaining to the city. They're basically laying down the new law. They're like, we own this place now. And to the extent that a lot of these Midwestern towns I mentioned are in fact being colonized, if you will, or seeing investment from other people, it's almost entirely urban lefties doing it. Or, people who grew up there, moved away, sort of became a progressive and moved back. If you go to one of these small towns and you go and say, well, who owns the coffee shop on the courthouse square or the bookstore, or who's renovating the old Victorian homes, it's like 90% of the time some kind of a lefty. And this is true even in places that vote overwhelmingly conservative. My in-laws are from a small town of 5,000 people in southwest Indiana. It's very working class. The county voted 75% for Trump. And I was very kind of pleased to see that they had a very nice coffee shop downtown. Well, went there, discovered, well, it's owned by a gay couple. And I did not ask them what their politics were, but statistically speaking, it's fairly likely that they vote Democrat. And I don't think that that's at all unusual. My heuristic is that conservatives tend to be pretty good institution builders, but they're pretty bad at creative endeavors. They're pretty bad at protecting institutions, and they're pretty bad at sort of seeing the value in things that have been run down a little bit. I think by contrast, the liberals, to leftist people tend to be very good at creative endeavors, and they tend to be pretty good at seeing value in sort of these roughed up places, and they're very, very good at taking things over, but they're not nearly so good at sort of building non-political institutions. You don't see a lot of startup kind of progressive liberal churches that end up flourishing, for example, but they're very good at taking over conservative churches. Again, progressives don't have as many kids, but they're very good at finding conservatives' kids to kind of convert to their way of thinking in college or elsewhere. And, this sounds like I'm kind of being negative towards them, but in fact, I think they've got a lot of positive things about them. They are the ones that see the value in these old Victorian homes, in the old rundown downtown, whereas conservatives essentially abandon that. They let everything that their forefathers built sort of decay into ruins, and they essentially abandon it, moved out to the fringe, and maybe even let it be taken over by people who have antithetical values to them. This is the proverbial conservatism that has never conserved anything. And then again, I would just say their cultural products of conservatives are generally pretty bad. I mean, pretty cringe, as they would say. Contemporary Christian music, a lot of it's just flat out bad. And so, liberals in a lot of ways have earned what they've gotten. And so one of the things, again, I'll just go back to Moscow. Another thing that just truly distinguishes them between all the other things that I said earlier is, unlike so many conservatives, Moscow's people, the Christchurch people, understood the value of being in the cultural center of Moscow. They didn't just build out on the fringes and live out on the fringes. If they did, nobody would probably care about them. They wouldn't have the cultural presence. The fact is, they wanted to be on Main Street, and they own a lot of stuff on Main Street, and they're very physically present on Main Street. They understood the value of the historic cultural core of a city in a way that most conservatives are not. So that's one thing I would say. Do not underestimate the value of the cultural center. And this could apply to a neighborhood center, when you get into a bigger city and there's sort of more than just one downtown. And the second thing is they have really been able to do some really top quality creative stuff. Like Canon Press, they've got like stuff on Netflix. They're doing Hollywood grade stuff. I was blown away by, when I went out to do Man Rampant, I'm looking at the cameras they're using. Like, these are the cameras that they're using to film Lord of the Rings. I mean, these guys really do excellent work. And so I think that's a couple things that could be imitated from them as well. Understand the value of the cultural center, and then really do things that are really top quality in the creative space. And so I just think this owned space model that they've come up with is very powerful, and I think very applicable in a lot of communities. Do I think that this solves all the problems of Christianity in America today? No, I do not. I think there are large parts of America, maybe much of suburbia, where this model doesn't apply. Maybe most of America lives there. But again, I don't think that there's just one or even two models for the negative world. There are many, many, many possible models. And this was just one that I would encourage you to study what the people of Moscow have done, and because I think there's a lot of impressive things. And I think, by the way, you guys have actually done a lot of that stuff too, so I don't want to sell you short. I'm just more familiar with them because I've actually been to Moscow before. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. All right, we have a break until 8:15, so take a break.